The envelope had no return address. I remember the precise moment I noticed it, sitting among the usual bills and circulars in the stack my assistant had left on my desk. Tuesday morning, October 14th, 9:47 a.m. I know the time because I looked at my watch 3 times while holding that thin manila folder as if the chronology of my awareness mattered. The paper was expensive, thick, cream-colored, and my name was written in a careful, deliberate hand. Harrison Blake, not Mr. Blake. Not Harrison Blake, VP of Operations, just Harrison. The way someone writes a name when they want it to feel personal, dangerous. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. This wasn't normal tremor, the kind that comes from too much coffee or the aging of a body that no longer responded to stimuli the way it did when I was 35. This was something deeper, recognition without understanding, fear before knowledge. I am 52 years old, and I have learned that the body sometimes knows truths before the mind catches up. My chest was tight. My throat had gone dry in that particular way that happens when your nervous system recognizes a threat your conscious mind hasn't yet processed. I sat down slowly in my leather chair, the one I had fought for in the 2003 restructuring, the one that faced the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. The city sprawled beneath me, indifferent to whatever was about to happen in this office on the 42nd floor. Inside the envelope were documents, photographs, emails printed on thick paper, dated over a span of 15 years, and a handwritten note folded carefully. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope. I didn't recognize it then, though I would come to know it intimately. The note read, "You were right. You were always right. But being right about the wrong things at the wrong time doesn't make you smart. It makes you dangerous. To yourself, especially. Call me." There was a phone number beneath it. I don't know how long I stared at that number before I understood what I was holding. 20 years. 2 decades. I had spent 20 years trying to convince myself that what I suspected was paranoia, professional jealousy disguised as insight, the bitterness of a man who wanted more than the world was willing to give him. And now, in October of 2024, on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the stock market had opened up 0.3%, and there was no reason to believe this day would be different from the 10,000 other days I had worked at Morrison and Heath, someone was telling me I had been right all along. The photograph on top was from 1994. I recognized myself immediately. I was 32. Thinner, with a full head of dark hair and the kind of unguarded smile that I haven't worn since my late 30s. I was standing next to Thomas Whitmore at a company retreat in Scottsdale. He had his arm around my shoulder, and both of us were laughing at something someone had said off camera. Thomas looked the same then as he did now, actually the same expensive suit, the same careful expression that suggested he was always 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation was happening around him. Behind us, there was a woman with sharp features and blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Margaret Chun, though she was Margaret Morrison then, before the divorce. Before everything, I turned the photograph over. There was a date written on the back, April 1994. Thomas and Harrison discussed the Toronto file. Notice Margaret in background listening. Always listening. The second photograph made my stomach contract. It was taken from the corner of an office. I recognized the space immediately as my old office on the 39th floor, the one I had been moved out of during the restructuring of 2008. But this photo was recent, taken within the last year. It showed Thomas at my desk, going through my files. The photograph was grainy, taken from what looked like a hidden camera positioned in the corner of the ceiling near the bookshelf. I had worked in that office for 14 years. I had never noticed a camera. The third photograph was from my apartment building. It showed me leaving for work on what I could determine was a Tuesday morning sometime in spring, based on the lightweight jacket I was wearing. There was someone following me. You could see them in the background, partially obscured by a parked car, but visible if you knew to look for them. I had never known to look. How many times had I walked out of that building over the years without seeing the people who were watching me? I set the photographs down and reached for the emails. The first was dated May 1994 between Thomas Whitmore and Margaret Morrison. The subject line read, "Potential security concern." The body of the email was brief. "Margaret, we have a talented analyst in Harrison Blake, but his trajectory is concerning. He's asking questions about the Toronto file that suggest he's understanding patterns we hadn't intended for anyone at his level to see. This could be useful or problematic depending on how we manage it. I'd like your input on whether we should encourage his advancement or minimize his influence. Your thoughts?" The response came the same day, 3:47 p.m. "I think we test him first. Advance him to the special projects team. See if advancement makes him more cooperative or more dangerous. We need to know which one he is." I had been promoted to the special projects team in June 1994. It had felt like vindication at the time. It felt like evidence now. More emails followed, spanning years. Conversations between Thomas and Margaret about me, about opportunities given and withdrawn, about monitoring my performance, about managing my ambitions. There were emails discussing my salary increases that had been deliberately capped despite my performance reviews. There were emails about why my promotion to director had been delayed by 6 years. There were emails from 2008 discussing the restructuring, with notes about how to elegantly remove Harrison from operations without making it seem like termination. That was the language they used, elegantly remove, as though I were a piece of furniture that didn't match the new design aesthetic. I sat very still for a long time. The office around me felt suddenly unfamiliar, despite the fact that I had spent nearly 4 decades working at Morrison and Heath. The city view that had once felt like vindication proof that I had made it, that I had been successful, now felt like the view from a cage. 42 stories above the street, watching the world move past while I slowly became invisible. My phone buzzed, an email notification. My assistant confirming that I had a 10 a.m. meeting with Thomas Whitmore to discuss the quarterly projections. Of course I did. We met every Tuesday morning. It was a ritual that had begun in 1998 and had never been broken. Through divorces, through health scares, through the reshuffling of the company that had turned Morrison and Heath into something I didn't quite recognize anymore. We were partners, or so I had always believed. We were collaborators. We had come up through the ranks together, and while Thomas had advanced further than I had accepted that as the natural consequence of his superior political skills. He was better at reading the room. He was better at knowing which battles to fight. He was better at understanding what the board wanted before they understood it themselves. Or perhaps he was simply better at lying. I looked at my watch. 9:54 a.m. I had 6 minutes to compose my face into something resembling normalcy before I had to walk into the conference room and sit across from a man who had been systematically undermining me for 20 years. 6 minutes to decide whether I would confront him, pretend I hadn't seen the envelope, or do something else entirely. 6 minutes to become the man I had been an hour ago before the proof had arrived. The second hand ticked forward. I stood up and walked to my office window. The morning sun was bright and harsh, and it cast sharp shadows across the buildings below. A woman on the street 42 stories down looked directly up at my building for a moment, as though she could feel my gaze. Of course she couldn't. That wasn't how the world worked. The world worked the way Thomas and Margaret had described it in their emails, with careful observation from a distance, with strategic advancement and strategic withdrawal, with the slow accumulation of power that came from knowing more than the person across from you. I turned back to the desk. I picked up the phone number from the note and made a decision. Instead of going to the 10 a.m. meeting, I would call. I would find out who had sent this envelope and why. I would find out who had been watching me, photographing me, documenting my life without my knowledge. And then I would decide what to do with the truth. I dialed the number. The person who answered sounded tired. She said her name was Rebecca Walsh, and she asked if I remembered her from the Toronto file. I didn't, not immediately. Not until she started talking, and something about the cadence of her voice triggered a memory from nearly 30 years ago. Rebecca Walsh had been a junior analyst on the Toronto project in 1994. She had been brilliant, someone I had recommended for advancement. She had disappeared from the company in 1996, and I had never known why. I was pushed out, she said now, speaking quietly, as though someone might be listening on the other end of the line. Just like you were. Just like everyone who figured out what Thomas and Margaret were doing. But unlike you, Harrison, I left a trail. I documented everything. I took photographs. I made copies of emails that were supposed to be deleted. I built a case that could destroy both of them. Why send it to me now? I asked. Why send it to me after 20 years? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Rebecca said, because I'm dying. Cancer. Stage 4. Pancreatic. My doctors give me 4 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. And I realize that I've spent 20 years sitting on evidence that could have changed your life, changed both our lives, and I've wasted that time being afraid, being silent. I don't have time to be silent anymore. My office seemed to tilt slightly. I reached for my desk chair and sat down. Who else knows? I asked. Only my daughter. She's been the one copying everything, uploading it to a secure cloud account. She's prepared to testify if necessary. She's prepared to release everything publicly if something happens to me. I've made arrangements, legal arrangements. But I wanted to give you the choice first, Harrison. I wanted to give you the option of knowing before you made any decisions. What kind of decisions? That's up to you. You could go to the board. You could go to the SEC. You could go to the press. Or you could do nothing. You could take the settlement they're about to offer you, yes. They're about to offer you a very generous settlement, by the way, effective at close of business today, and you could walk away and live a quiet life. You've earned it. God knows you've earned it. They're offering me a settlement? Thomas is retiring today. Margaret left 2 weeks ago. She's already in the Caymans, actually. They're dismantling the evidence from their end as quickly as they can. But they can't dismantle what I've kept. I looked at the photographs on my desk. The image of me in 1994, laughing next to Thomas Whitmore. The image of Thomas going through my files. The image of someone following me out of my apartment building. 20 years of documentation. 20 years of proof. I'll call you back, I said. I need to think about this. You have until close of business, Rebecca said. After that, I'm releasing everything to the media and the SEC regardless of what you decide. Consider it my final act of principle. She hung up. I sat in my office chair and stared at the closed door. At 10 a.m. exactly, my assistant knocked and asked if I was ready for my meeting with Thomas. I said no. I said I was feeling ill. I asked her to cancel all my meetings for the day and to tell security I was leaving the building. Then I did what I haven't done in nearly 40 years of working at Morrison and Heath. I walked out of my office, past my assistant's desk, past the executive suites and the conference rooms with their floor-to-ceiling windows and their view of success, and I went down to the parking garage. My car was a 2018 Mercedes, silver, expensive, a purchase I had made during the brief period in my mid-40s when I had believed I had finally arrived, finally achieved the level of success that would bring peace. It hadn't, but it was a very nice car, and the leather interior still smelled faintly of new money. I drove without direction. Somewhere around 11 a.m., I found myself heading toward the coast. I drove north on the highway, past the suburbs and the chain restaurants and the commercial parks that all looked identical, and eventually I reached the small town where my ex-wife lived. I hadn't seen Diane in 8 years. We had been married for 23 years. We had a daughter, Emma, who was now 28 and lived in Seattle with her girlfriend. Diane was remarried. to a therapist named Michael, who seemed genuinely kind during the one conversation I'd had with him at Emma's college graduation. I sat in my car in front of Diane's house for a long time. It was a nice house, a Cape Cod with blue shutters, exactly the kind of house Diane had always wanted. I had been the one who had opposed buying it back in 2010, arguing that we needed to preserve capital, that property taxes were too high in this area, that we should wait a few years before making such a large commitment. So Diane had stayed with me for another 6 years while I worked 70-hour weeks and attended strategy meetings and fought for positions that were ultimately meaningless. And then, when she finally left, she had bought the house anyway with Michael's help, and she had become happy in a way that she had never been with me. I didn't go to the door. Instead, I drove back toward the city. The stock market had closed by the time I was back in the financial district. The news was already out. Thomas Whitmore had announced his retirement effective immediately, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with his family. Margaret Chun's departure hadn't been announced yet, but it was only a matter of time. I could imagine the statement. Family situation required immediate attention, grateful for years of service, blah, blah, blah. I parked in the Morrison and Heath garage and walked back up to the 42nd floor. It was 4:30 p.m. Most of the staff had gone home. The executive offices were mostly dark. I walked directly to my office, closed the door, and sat down. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. The tears came from somewhere very deep inside my chest, someplace I had sealed off around 1996. When I had realized that my career was not going to follow the trajectory I had planned for it, that something was happening that I didn't understand, that people I trusted were making decisions about me without my knowledge or consent, that the world did not work the way I had been taught it worked. I cried for the years I had spent trying to convince myself that the problem was me, that I was being too suspicious, too paranoid, too ambitious for my own good. I cried for the promotions that had come and gone. I cried for the title that should have been director but had been downgraded to senior VP. I cried for the opportunities that had been given and then withdrawn at the last moment, always with some plausible explanation, always with a reason that couldn't be argued against. When I finally stopped crying, it was past 5 p.m. The security guard made his evening rounds, and I heard him pause outside my office door. He didn't open it. He simply moved on, the way he had moved on countless nights when he found me still at my desk, long after everyone else had gone home. I pulled out my phone and called Rebecca Walsh's number. "I've made my decision," I said when she answered. "Already?" She sounded surprised. "I'm going to the SEC first," I said. "Tomorrow morning. I'm going to walk in there with these documents, with your photographs, with everything. And I'm going to tell them the entire story, starting from 1994. "That's good," Rebecca said, and I could hear relief in her voice. "That's the right decision. Then I'm going to the press. And I'm going to make sure that every major publication knows what they did. Not just to me, but to everyone. I want their names in every headline. I want their faces associated with this. I want it to be impossible for them to ever work in this industry again." "What about the settlement?" Rebecca asked. "I'm going to refuse it. I'm going to refuse it publicly, and I'm going to explain why. I'm going to make it clear that I'm not doing this for money, even though money is exactly what Morrison and Heath will try to believe this is about. I'm going to make it clear that I'm doing this because I have nothing left to lose." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You realize they'll fight you," Rebecca finally said. "They'll hire the best lawyers. They'll dispute everything. They'll try to make you look unstable. They'll say the documents are fake. They'll do whatever it takes to discredit you." "I know," I said. "And you're going to do it anyway?" "Yes," I said, "because I realized something today after I'd been sitting in this office for about an hour. I realized that I've already spent 20 years of my life letting them control the narrative. I've spent 20 years being silent about what I suspected but couldn't prove. And now that I have proof, I'm not going to waste another day staying quiet. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my office. The city lights spread out below me, and I watched the traffic move past, headlights creating patterns that seemed almost meaningful if you looked at them the right way. I didn't go home that night. I stayed in the office and began reviewing all the materials Rebecca had sent. The photographs, the emails, the documentation. I cross-referenced everything against my own records, my own emails, my own calendar. It all fit together like a complex puzzle that had been waiting 20 years for someone to be patient enough to assemble it. At 3 a.m., I found something that made me gasp. It was an email dated January 2008, about 6 months before the restructuring that would eventually force me out of the operations division. The email was between Thomas and the CEO, David Rothstein. It read, "David, we have a situation with Harrison. He's begun asking questions about variance in the Toronto file expenses from 15 years ago. This is the kind of detail that shouldn't matter to someone at his level. He should be focused on quarterly projections, not historical inconsistencies. I'm concerned that he's becoming a liability. I'd like your approval to move him to a position where his curiosity is less relevant." The CEO's response came the same day, "Handle it. I don't want any noise, and I don't want his name associated with anything that might appear in discovery if there's ever a future legal situation. Make him invisible. Handle it. Make him invisible." Those were the words they had used to describe my career. I was not someone to be developed or challenged or promoted based on merit. I was a situation to be managed, an inconvenient observer to be moved out of the line of sight. I saved copies of all the emails to my personal cloud account. I printed copies on Morrison and Heath's printers, which felt like a small act of rebellion, knowing that somewhere, someone was probably monitoring my activity. Let them see me take this. Let them understand that the game was over. When dawn came, I was still in my office. The cleaning staff moved past my glass walls without acknowledging me. At 6 a.m., I showered in the executive bathroom, changed into fresh clothes that I kept in my office for nights like this nights, when work had demanded so much that I couldn't justify the time to go home and come back. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Janet Kozak, and she specialized in corporate malfeasance. I had found her name in a legal directory the previous evening while I was going through the materials. She had a reputation for being aggressive and meticulous, for taking on cases against large corporations and winning. When I called her office at 6:45 a.m., the recording said they opened at 8 a.m. I left a message saying that I had evidence of systematic, corporate fraud spanning 20 years, and that I needed to meet with her before 9 a.m. that same day. She called me back at 7:30 a.m. "Your message was intriguing," Janet said. Her voice was brisk, professional, the voice of someone used to evaluating whether something was worth her time. "Tell me briefly what you have." I summarized the situation. The emails, the photographs, the documentation spanning 2 decades, the systematic targeting of employees who had become inconvenient observers. The financial implications, which Rebecca's analysis suggested involved millions of dollars in fraudulent expense reporting. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Can you be in my office in an hour?" Janet asked. "Yes," I said. "Bring everything. And bring that phone number you were given. I want to talk to your source." I gathered all the materials into a leather portfolio that I used for client presentations. The photographs, the printed emails, the documentation. Then I did something I'd been planning to do since about 4:30 a.m. I wrote a letter of resignation. It was addressed to the board of directors of Morrison and Heath. It was brief, effective immediately. "I am resigning from my position at Morrison and Heath. I am doing this because I have become aware of evidence suggesting systematic corporate fraud spanning a period of 20 years. This fraud has involved the manipulation of employee careers, the falsification of expense reports, the installation of surveillance equipment in company spaces, and the systematic targeting of employees who questioned authority. Rather than continue to work for an organization that has engaged in these practices, I am choosing to pursue legal remedies and to cooperate fully with federal authorities in their investigation of these matters. I was 52 years old and I didn't know who I was anymore. But I knew who I wasn't. I wasn't someone who stayed silent. I wasn't someone who accepted gaslighting and manipulation as the cost of doing business. I wasn't someone who traded his integrity for a position on the 42nd floor. I left the letter on my desk, where my assistant would find it when she arrived at 8 a.m. Then I walked out of Morrison and Heath and didn't look back. Janet Kazak's was in a different building, about 3 blocks away. It was in an older structure, the kind of building that had character, that had been renovated but not slick, not trying too hard to impress anyone. I liked it immediately. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and windows that overlooked a small park. The receptionist was a woman in her 60s who seemed to have the kind of competence that came from doing the same job for a long time and doing it well. Janet herself was in her mid-50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she missed nothing. She reviewed my materials for 2 hours, asking me questions about dates, about my relationship with Thomas Whitmore, about what I'd noticed over the years that hadn't made sense. She took extensive notes. She asked to speak with Rebecca Walsh directly, and I provided Rebecca's number. While Janet was on the phone with Rebecca, I sat in her office and looked at the photographs on her walls. Janet Kazak had won some significant cases. There were photographs of her shaking hands with people I recognized from news stories. There was a framed article about a settlement she had negotiated that had totaled $47 million. There was a photograph of her with her wife and 2 children, all of them smiling, all of them looking genuinely happy. When Janet returned from her call, she said, "Your friend Rebecca is sharp. Her documentation is very solid, and she's willing to testify?" "Yes," I said. "And she's prepared to release all of this publicly if we don't act quickly. She's apparently concerned that Thomas and Margaret will try to destroy evidence. They probably already have," Janet said. She sat down in her chair and looked at me directly. "Here's what I think we should do. We file a complaint with the SACE kit today. We go to the FBI tomorrow. We brief the press on Thursday. That timeline gives us the ability to get our story out before Morrison and Heath can control the narrative. They're already in damage control mode. Thomas's retirement is going to look suspicious very quickly. We need to make sure the media understands why." "What about my career?" I asked. "What about the fact that I'm going to be completely unemployable in the finance industry after this?" Janet smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had made a calculation. "Your career at Morrison and Heath was already over. What's happening now is not a loss of a career path, it's a redirection. You're going to be the man who exposed systematic corporate fraud. In 6 months, maybe a year, that's going to make you valuable in ways you can't currently imagine. There are consulting firms that will pay you substantial fees to advise them on compliance. There are universities that will want you to teach business ethics. Your story is going to be worth something." I had not thought about this aspect of things. I had been focused on the investigation, on the proof, on the confrontation. I had not considered what came after. "I need to think about this," I said. "You don't have time to think," Janet said. "Rebecca Walsh is dying. That means everything hinges on moving forward now. If you wait, if you hesitate, if you try to consider all the implications, you'll miss the window. And when Rebecca dies, when her protection disappears, that evidence could disappear too. Is that what you want?" I looked at the photograph of Janet with her family. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "Taking on these cases?" 23 years, Janet said. "And I've learned that most people don't come into my office because they're trying to be heroes. They come in because they finally run out of ways to avoid confrontation. They finally accepted that staying silent is more expensive than speaking up. Is that where you are, Harrison?" "I think so," I said. "Yes. Then let's proceed," Janet said. We spent the rest of the day preparing materials for the SEEK. Janet had a team of junior lawyers who were remarkably efficient. By 4 p.m., we had compiled a comprehensive package that included all of Rebecca's documentation, my own timeline, a detailed analysis of the financial implications, and a summary statement that would serve as the opening for the formal complaint. At 5 p.m., Janet drove with me to the CSIC offices in Boston. We walked in at 5:30, 15 minutes before they closed for the day, and asked to speak with the regional director. The receptionist told us he had gone home. Janet said, "Tell him that I have a complaint involving systemic corporate fraud at a major financial services company. Tell him that I'll be filing this complaint first thing tomorrow morning and that he might want to be here when it happens." 20 minutes later, the regional director, a man named Raymond Thomas, who I recognized vaguely from news stories about financial fraud cases, came out to meet us. He looked tired, the way SEC officials always look tired, as though they're carrying the weight of every corporate malfeasance that's ever happened. Janet summarized our case in 10 minutes. She showed him the key documents. She explained the timeline. She made it clear that the evidence was solid and that multiple sources could testify. Raymond Thomas listened without interrupting. When Janet finished, he said, "When can you file the formal complaint?" "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., Janet said. "I'll be here," Raymond said. "And I suggest you do not discuss this with anyone at Morrison and Heath before you file. Not formally, anyway. They need to hear about this from federal authorities, not from you." I had not planned to contact Thomas or Margaret, but hearing Raymond's instruction made me realize that I was not going to. The only person at Morrison and Heath who would hear from me would be David Rothstein, the CEO. I had something to tell him, and it would come from me directly. That evening, I called Rothstein's office. The receptionist told me he had left for the day. I said it was urgent. She said she would pass along the message. 2 hours later, Rothstein called me back. "Harrison," he said, and there was something unusual in his voice, something that sounded like fear. "I heard you resigned today. That came as a surprise." "I'm sure it did," I said. "I'm calling because I wanted to give you a chance to get ahead of this situation. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing a complaint with the SEC. The complaint details systematic corporate fraud spanning 20 years. Including financial irregularities in the Toronto file, surveillance of employees, and the deliberate career obstruction of individuals who asked inconvenient questions. Multiple sources are prepared to testify, including employees who have already left the company." There was a very long silence on the other end of the line. "Harrison," Rothstein finally said, "I think you should consider very carefully what you're about to do. Thomas and Margaret have been with this company for a very long time. If you make these kinds of accusations public, you're going to face defamation suits. You're going to face." I hung up. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I simply ended the call. That night, I drove back to the coast. I drove past my ex-wife's house, but I didn't stop. I drove to the small motel where Rebecca Walsh had said she was staying. A place called the Captain's Rest about 5 miles south of Diane's neighborhood. She had asked me to come by if I had decided to move forward. She was sitting on a bench outside her room when I arrived, watching the ocean. She was thinner than I would have expected, and her complexion had that particular grayness that comes with terminal illness. She was wearing a wig, I realized. Her natural hair had apparently fallen out from chemotherapy. "You're doing it," she said when she saw me. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. I sat down on the bench next to her. "Tomorrow morning. Are you scared?" "Terrified," I said. "Good," Rebecca said. "If you weren't scared, you wouldn't understand what you're risking. Thomas and Margaret will fight this with everything they have. They'll hire the best lawyers. They'll dispute the authenticity of the documents. They'll try to paint you as a disgruntled employee who's making this up for attention or revenge. Let them," I said. "I'm tired of being the only person who knows the truth." Rebecca turned to look at me. In the lamplight from the motel parking lot, she looked very old, much older than her actual age, which I calculated to be about 54. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something that's not in the documents." "What?" When I left the company in 1996, it was because I was about to be fired. Thomas told me privately that if I resigned quietly, they would give me a severance package and a reference. If I didn't resign, they would ensure that I never worked in finance again. That was the trade-off. My silence from my financial survival, and I took it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to understand what's about to happen to you. You're about to lose your career. Your industry will close ranks against you. The people you worked with, the people you considered friends, they're going to abandon you. There's going to be a period, probably several years, where you're going to struggle to find work. You're going to feel invisible in a different way than you felt invisible at Morrison and Heath. At Morrison and Heath, you were invisible to your superiors. After this, you're going to be invisible to your peers. Nobody is going to want to hire you because nobody wants to be associated with someone who sued their former employer." I listened to what Rebecca was saying, and I understood that she was preparing me for a loss I hadn't yet fully grasped. My career was not going to be paused or redirected. It was going to be over. The finance industry was a small world, and word would travel. Harrison Blake was a troublemaker. Harrison Blake was willing to go after his colleagues. Harrison Blake could not be trusted. "Why did you want me to know this?" I asked. "Because I didn't know," Rebecca said. "When I left in 1996, I thought I could just find another job. I thought the finance industry was big enough that I could start over. I was wrong. I spent 8 years looking for work. Legitimate work. Work that I was qualified for. I did temp jobs. I worked retail. I worked as a secretary. I got an accounting degree from night school, trying to rebuild my credibility. Eventually, I did get back into finance at a smaller firm in a different city. But those 8 years, those were lost. I was 48 years old when I finally rebuilt my career, and by then I realized that I was never going to get back what I'd lost." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the ocean. The waves were calm, regular, predictable in a way that nothing else in my life had been for the past 12 hours. "Why did you keep the documents?" I asked. "Why did you keep them for 28 years?" "Because part of me always knew I would need them," Rebecca said. "Part of me knew that one day I would decide that my dignity was more important than my career. And part of me wanted to know, when that day came, that I had done everything I could to protect someone else from the same experience. I couldn't protect myself. But maybe I could help protect you. And what do you get out of this?" I asked. Rebecca smiled, and it was a sad smile. "I get to feel like my life mattered. I get to feel like the years I spent being silent weren't completely wasted. I get to know that I did something true before I die." I drove back to the city that night. I drove through the darkness and thought about the versions of myself that had already been lost. The version of myself who had trusted that hard work and talent were enough. The version of myself who had believed in the system. The version of myself who had accepted gaslighting as something that happened to other people, not to him. The cess complaint was filed at 9:15 a.m. on Wednesday, October 16, 2024. Janet Kozak presented it to Raymond Thomas and a team of federal investigators. Within hours, subpoenas had been issued. Within days, the SEC had begun examining Morrison and Heath's books. Within 2 weeks, the company announced that it was conducting an internal investigation into the allegations. The media coverage was intense and immediate. By Thursday morning, the story was in every major financial publication. Morrison and Heath under investigation for alleged fraud. 20-year pattern of employee intimidation. SEC launches probe into senior executive misconduct. Thomas. Whitmore's lawyer immediately released a statement denying the allegations. Margaret Chen had no comment. David Rothstein did a carefully worded interview in which he expressed his commitment to corporate integrity and his full cooperation with the investigation. But the story had shifted. I had become the narrative, not the disgruntled employee, not the paranoid middle manager, the whistleblower, the person brave enough to come forward. What they didn't show in the media coverage was what happened in the weeks that followed. I moved into a temporary apartment after my meeting with Janet Kozak. I couldn't face going back to my own place, where I might run into neighbors who had seen me leave for work every day for the past 5 years. I couldn't face the silence, the time, the questions about what came next. Janet advised me not to speak publicly about the case, citing the ongoing investigation. So I did what I had been doing for the past 20 years, but in reverse, I stayed silent. I waited. I tried to process what was happening. It was during this period that I discovered what no one told me about being a whistleblower. They didn't tell me that vindication would feel like loss. They didn't tell me that having my suspicions confirmed would be almost as painful as the uncertainty. They didn't tell me that I would spend the first 2 weeks after filing the complaint feeling a kind of weightless dislocation, as though I had stepped off the edge of something and was falling through space with no bottom in sight. I didn't leave the apartment much. Janet had instructed me to stay available for interviews with federal investigators, but most of that happened via video conference or telephone calls. I gave my statement to the SEIC. I provided additional documentation. I answered questions about emails, about meetings, about moments in my career when I had sensed something was wrong, but had been unable to articulate what it was. The investigators were professional but thorough. They wanted to understand not just what had happened, but why I had stayed at Morrison and Heath for so long if I suspected wrongdoing. The answer to that question was complicated. I had stayed because I didn't have proof. I had stayed because I was afraid of being wrong. I had stayed because leaving would have felt like admitting that I had wasted 35 years of my life on a company and colleagues who didn't value me. I had stayed because the alternative, unemployment, the loss of identity, the free fall into an unknown future, had seemed worse than the slow suffocation of staying. On October 28th, Rebecca Walsh died. Her daughter called me to tell me. The funeral service was held on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after Rebecca had sent me the envelope. I attended, sitting in the back of a small church in a town I didn't know, watching people I didn't recognize grieve for a woman I had just met. Her daughter, Sarah, came up to me after the service. She was younger than I would have expected, maybe 30, with her mother's sharp features and intelligent eyes. "Thank you for what you did," Sarah said. "My mother wanted to give me the option to release the documents publicly if something happened to her, but she hoped you would take it public. She said that having you come forward would mean more than anything I could do. Your mother was a remarkable person," I said. "She was angry," Sarah said. "For 28 years she was angry. It was eating her from the inside. I think part of why the cancer progressed so quickly was because anger is toxic. It ruins you from the inside out. But that last week, after she knew you were going to file the complaint, I saw her relax for the first time in my entire adult life. She died knowing that her anger had been justified, that what she suspected had been true. I think that meant something to her. I understood that I would spend a lot of time thinking about what Rebecca's anger had cost her. I would spend a lot of time wondering if my silence had somehow enabled her continued suffering. But standing in that church, with her daughter's hand resting briefly on my arm, I could only say thank you. The investigation into Morrison and Heath lasted 6 months. In that time, I was deposed multiple times. I attended meetings with federal prosecutors. I testified before a grand jury. I began consulting with Janet Kozak on legal strategy, becoming something of an expert in my own case. What emerged was a picture of institutional corruption that went much deeper than I had initially understood. The Toronto file had involved inflated consulting expenses designed to mask kickback payments to government officials in Canada. The surveillance had been installed in order to monitor employees who might discover the truth. The career manipulation had been a systematic effort to eliminate anyone who might become a liability to the scheme. There were others besides me. A woman named Louise Chun had been pushed out in 1999 for asking questions about the Toronto file audits. A man named Michael Rodriguez had been terminated in 2005 under the pretext of downsizing, despite having an exceptional performance review. An entire division of junior analysts had been cycled through Morrison and Heath, specifically to work on the Toronto file, and then been eliminated to prevent them from talking. It was more systematic than I had imagined. It was also less personally targeted than I had believed. I had thought the campaign against me was unique, that I had somehow provoked particular attention. In reality, I had just been one of many. The machinery of institutional fraud didn't care about individual personalities. It simply ground forward, consuming whoever got in its way. On April 3, 2025, David Rothstein was arrested at his home. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Thomas Whitmore turned himself in voluntarily, accepting a plea deal that involved cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Margaret Chen was arrested at Miami Airport, attempting to flee the country. I watched the news coverage from my temporary apartment. David Rothstein's mugshot looked diminished somehow, made small by the crimes he had committed. Thomas Whitmore walked into the courthouse with his lawyers, still trying to project confidence even though everyone could see the facade was cracking. Margaret Chun stared directly at the camera with defiance, and I realized in that moment that she had never truly believed she would be held accountable. Janet called me that evening to congratulate me. She said that the case against Morrison and Heath was solid, that prosecutions would likely follow, that I had done something important by coming forward. She said she had already received calls from 3 different organizations asking if I would be interested in consulting work. She said that the University of Chicago Law School had inquired about whether I might be willing to teach a course on business ethics. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. On April 15, 2025, I received a letter from Morrison and Heath's legal team. It was notification that the company was offering me a severance settlement in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. The amount was substantial, more than 2 years of my salary. They had calculated, apparently, that it was cheaper to pay me to stay silent than to allow me to continue cooperating with prosecutors. I gave the letter to Janet. She said, "This is interesting. It suggests they believe the prosecution case is weaker than they're letting on. Or they're trying to limit your testimony by binding you to an NDA. What should I do?" I asked. "That depends," Janet said. "Do you need the money?" I thought about this. I had been living on my savings for 6 months. I had accrued no new debt. My rent was moderate. I had time. "No," I said. "I don't need the money." "Then refuse," Janet said, "and make your refusal public. The prosecutors need witnesses who are willing to talk. You're the most credible witness they have. The fact that you're willing to walk away from a substantial settlement is evidence that you're motivated by something other than money." I drafted a response to Morrison and Heath's legal team. "I am declining your settlement offer. I will continue to cooperate fully with all federal investigations into Morrison and Heath's activities. I have no interest in accepting compensation for my silence." I released the letter to the press the same day. By May, the story had mostly faded from the news cycle. There were other scandals, other corporate failures, other dramas that captured the public attention. Morrison and Heath became a footnote, a story that ended with government investigation rather than with any particular resolution. But that didn't mean the story was over. It meant it had simply moved into the slower, more legal phase where the real consequences were determined. In June, I attended my first meeting with a consulting firm that wanted to hire me as an advisor on corporate compliance. They offered me 6 months of consulting work at a rate that was considerably more than I had earned in the final years at Morrison and Heath. I accepted, and I discovered that there was something satisfying about building something new, about using my hard-won knowledge about the ways that institutions fail. In July, I agreed to teach an evening course at the University of Chicago Law School called Corporate Corruption and Personal Integrity. University provided housing for faculty, so I moved out of my temporary apartment and into a small house near campus. My daughter Emma called to say congratulations and asked if she could attend one of my lectures. I said yes, and I felt something like pride in that moment, not the hollow pride of climbing the corporate ladder, but real pride in having done something true. In August, the first of the prosecutions went to trial. Thomas Whitmore pled guilty to all charges, accepting a 5-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation. David Rothstein fought the charges and was convicted on 3 counts of wire fraud and sentenced to 8 years. Margaret Chun accepted a plea deal and received a 4-year sentence. When the verdict came down for David Rothstein, I was teaching my summer lecture. I checked the news during a break and saw the headline, CEO convicted in massive fraud scheme. I felt a moment of something triumph, maybe, or satisfaction, but mostly I felt tired. After class, a young woman approached me. She was one of my students, a first-year law student named Priya, who had been particularly engaged in the discussions about institutional corruption. "That must feel good," she said, "having them all convicted." "I'm not sure good is the right word," I said. "They destroyed a lot of lives. They stole a lot of time and opportunity from people who trusted them. Conviction doesn't restore any of that." Priya looked thoughtful. "Do you regret coming forward?" she asked. I had been asked this question many times in various forms. Journalists wanted to know if I was happy with the outcome. Lawyers wanted to know if I would recommend whistleblowing to others in similar situations. Consulting clients wanted to know if I thought my actions had been worthwhile. And I had learned that the honest answer was, it's complicated. "I regret that it was necessary," I said. "I regret that the system didn't catch this on its own. I regret that it took 20 years for the truth to come out and that Rebecca Walsh had to die before anyone was willing to listen. But do I regret the act of coming forward? No, I don't regret that." That night, I drove back to the coast. I drove past the motel where Rebecca had stayed, now just a memory of a place I had visited twice. I drove past my ex-wife's house. This time, I decided to stop. Diane answered the door with surprise and then something like wariness. She had moved on with her life, and the appearance of her ex-husband on her doorstep after months of silence was probably not the kind of thing she had expected. "Hi," I said. "I was in the area. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" Diane asked. "For leaving," I said. "For getting out. You saw something was wrong with me, and instead of waiting for me to figure it out, you saved yourself. I understand now that that was the right choice." Diane's expression softened. "Come inside," she said. "Have some coffee." Michael was there, and he shook my hand without any awkwardness, which I appreciated. We sat in Diane's living room, the room I had never lived in, because I had left before it became hers, and talked about Emma, about Michael's work as a therapist, about the life that Diane had built after leaving me. It was a pleasant conversation, neither warm nor cold. Two people who had been married once and were now essentially strangers who happened to share a history. Before I left, Diane said something that I've thought about many times since. "You know what the hardest part was?" she said. "It wasn't you working too much or caring about your career too much. It was that you were never really present. Even when you were here physically, you were somewhere else mentally. You were always suspicious, always trying to figure out if people were betraying you. And I realized that I couldn't help you with that. Only you could do that." I thought about this as I drove back to Chicago. I thought about the version of myself that had been present but paranoid, that had been ambitious but suspicious, that had been capable but unable to trust. I thought about how much of my own suffering had come not from what Thomas and Margaret had done to me, but from my own fear of what they were doing. The trial phase of the Morrison and Heath scandal lasted through the fall and into the winter. I testified on several occasions, presenting to the court the documentation of the systematic fraud. Each time I testified, I felt less affected by it. The story that had consumed my life for 6 months had become simply evidence, facts to be presented and evaluated. By December, the scandal had completely faded from public consciousness. The criminal convictions had been handed down. The civil suits were moving through the court system. Morrison and Heath itself was being dismantled, its assets sold to a competitor, its corporate structure essentially dissolved. I had been in Chicago for 5 months when Emma came to visit for Christmas. She attended one of my lectures, sitting in the back of the classroom with her girlfriend, Rachel, and watching me teach a room full of law students about the nature of institutional corruption. Afterward, we went to dinner at a small restaurant near campus. "I'm proud of you," Emma said. "I want you to know that. I know it's been complicated and difficult, but what you did was right." "Your mother said something similar," I said. "She said I needed to be present instead of being suspicious, that I needed to trust instead of constantly trying to figure out who was betraying me." "And?" Emma asked. "Have you learned how to do that?" "I'm learning," I said. "I don't know if I'll ever fully learn it. 20 years is a long time to be afraid of the world." Rachel, who I had only met a few times before, said, "But you're still standing. You still came forward. You still did the right thing even though it cost you everything." "Not everything," I said. "I still have my daughter. I still have my integrity. I still have the ability to build something new. I lost my career, but I was beginning to realize that my career had been an elaborate performance. It wasn't real." This, I gestured around at the restaurant, at the three of us at the present moment. This is real. This is what matters. On December 28, 2025, I received a call from Janet Kozak. She told me that the settlement agreement between Morrison and Heath and its former employees had been finalized. The company had agreed to pay out $287 million in settlements to employees whose careers had been impacted by fraudulent practices. As the primary whistleblower, I was eligible for a portion of this settlement, along with protection from retaliation. The amount was significant, more than $1 million, more than I had earned in the final 5 years at Morrison and Heath. What should I do? I asked Janet. "That's entirely up to you," Janet said. "You could take the money, you could donate it, you could do something with it. There's no wrong answer." I thought about this for a long time. By early 2026, I had decided what to do. I donated half of the settlement to a nonprofit organization that provided support to whistleblowers. I set aside a portion for Emma and Rachel as a gift, and I kept the rest, enough to give me financial security for the first time in my adult life. With that security came something unexpected: freedom. Not freedom from consequences, those would follow me for the rest of my life, but freedom from fear. Freedom from the desperation that had kept me at Morrison and Heath for so long. Freedom to say no to things I didn't believe in. I continued teaching at the University of Chicago Law School through the spring. My course filled every semester. Students came to learn not just about corporate fraud, but about the cost of integrity, about what it meant to stand up against institutions, about how to recognize corruption and what to do when you did recognize it. In March, I was invited to speak at a conference on corporate ethics. The conference was attended by government officials, prosecutors, and corporate compliance officers. I told them the story of my 20 years at Morrison and Heath. I told them about the emails and the photographs. I told them about the moment I realized I had been systematically undermined. I told them about Rebecca Walsh and her dying wish to finally be heard. And I told them what I had learned, that corruption doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens in personal relationships. It happens in small decisions that accumulate over time. It happens when people prioritize loyalty to institutions over commitment to truth. It happens when we're afraid. One of the prosecutors approached me after the speech. She said her name was Carol Mitchell, and she specialized in white-collar crime prosecution. "Your story keeps me going," she told me. "In this job, you see a lot of people destroy their lives for a little bit of money or power. It's easy to become cynical. But then I hear stories like yours about someone who finally chose truth over comfort, and I remember why I do this work. I was 53 years old now, and I had lived more in the past 18 months than I had in the previous 20 years. I had lost my career, but I had found something that might be more valuable: authentic work, meaningful work, work that felt true. In May, I received an invitation from the Society of Professional Journalists. They wanted to feature my story in a documentary about whistleblowers. I accepted, because I understood that my story could serve as a cautionary tale but also as an inspiration. If even one person recognized corruption because of what I had experienced, then the 18 months of loss and fear would have been worth it. The documentary was filmed over the summer. It included interviews with me, with Janet Kazak, with investigators from the SEC. It included interviews with Louise Chen and Michael Rodriguez, the other employees who had been pushed out by Morrison and Heath's fraudulent practices. It included Rebecca's daughter Sarah talking about her mother's decision to keep the documentation and her final wish to see justice served. When it premiered in September 2026, I watched it with Emma and Rachel. Sitting in the theater, seeing my own face on the screen, hearing my own voice telling the story I had lived through, it was surreal. But it was also clarifying. I understood that the pain I had experienced had been real and had mattered. But I also understood that I had survived it. That night, I had a text message from an unknown number. It read, "I worked at Morrison and Heath from 2003 to 2010. I was pushed out during the restructuring, and I've spent the last 16 years convinced that I was the problem. I just watched your documentary, and I realized I wasn't alone. I realized I wasn't paranoid. Thank you for coming forward. Thank you for telling the truth." I never responded to the text because I didn't know how to respond, but I saved it. I saved it as a reminder that my choice to speak up had had ripples beyond what I could measure. In December 2026, exactly 2 years after Rebecca Walsh had sent me the envelope, I was sitting in my office at the University of Chicago Law School preparing a new course called Ethics and Personal Integrity in the Corporate World. My phone rang. It was a lawyer representing another Fortune 500 company. They had heard my story, and they wanted to hire me as a special consultant to help them uncover and address potential fraud within their own organization. How much time would this require? I asked. Substantial, the lawyer said. We're trying to be proactive. We want to understand where our vulnerabilities are before they become liabilities. We're willing to pay whatever your rate is. I'll need to think about it, I said. But I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to accept the engagement. I was going to leverage my experience, my hard-won knowledge, my scars. I was going to help other companies avoid the institutional corruption that I had spent 20 years watching happen at Morrison and Heath. I was going to turn my pain into purpose. That evening, I called Emma. I told her about the consulting opportunity. I told her that I was thinking about diversifying my work, about balancing teaching with consulting. I told her that I felt, for the first time in my adult life, that I was building something that mattered. "Dad," Emma said, and I could hear her smiling through the phone, "I think you finally figured out what being an adult is supposed to be about." I thought about this as I sat in my office, watching the sun set over Chicago. I thought about the version of myself who had walked into Morrison and Heath 40 years ago, young and ambitious and certain that hard work would be enough. I thought about the version of myself who had spent 20 years suspended between suspicion and denial, afraid to trust his own perceptions, but also afraid to act on them. I thought about the version of myself who had walked out of Morrison and Heath and didn't look back. And I thought about the version of myself who was still becoming, still learning what it meant to build a life based on truth instead of performance. The winter of 2026 was cold and harsh, but it felt clean. It felt honest. It felt like the beginning of something, not the end. 20 years had passed between the first moment I suspected something was wrong at Morrison and Heath and the moment I had proof. 20 years of silence. 20 years of doubt, 20 years of being invisible in ways that would have been easier to understand if only I had been able to see clearly. But now, at 53, I finally understood what Rebecca Walsh had known for 28 years. That truth is expensive. That courage requires accepting loss. That integrity is a choice you have to make over and over again, even when no one is watching. Finally, after 20 years, the proof had arrived that changed everything. But the real change hadn't come from the proof itself. It had come from my decision to accept it, act on it, and build a new life from the rubble of the old one. And that, I had learned, was the only kind of change that was ever real.